The trigger pull was never meant to be heard. It was supposed to disappear into the noise of Harlem, the rattle of the elevated tracks, the late-night laughter spilling out of basement clubs, the low hum of a city that never asked permission to keep breathing. But when the shot cracked through the winter air on 135th Street, it cut clean through everything. One sound. Sharp. Final. Men stopped mid-step. A woman gasped from a third-floor window. Somewhere down the block, a trumpet kept crying through a jazz solo, unaware that a line had just been crossed. The body hit the pavement hard, the echo of bone on concrete louder than the gunshot itself. Blood spread slow and dark beneath the street lamp, pooling where light and shadow met. And the man standing closest to it, the man everyone in Harlem recognized without needing to see his face, did not move. Bumpy Johnson stood still, hat brim low, coat collar turned up against the cold. His eyes stayed fixed on the body, not in shock, not in triumph, but in calculation. The shooter lowered the pistol, his hands steady, his breathing controlled. That alone told Bumpy everything he needed to know. This wasn't panic. This was a message, and it was one no one was meant to hear. Because in Harlem, gunshots were currency. They spoke when words failed. They settled arguments men were too proud to finish with their mouths. But this one rang different. This one carried consequences. Bumpy exhaled slowly. He already knew what this would cost. What he didn't yet know was how far the ripples would travel. To understand why that single shot mattered, you had to understand the man standing beneath the street lamp. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not born into power. Harlem didn't hand him respect. He took it, inch by inch, year by year, through discipline, intelligence, and a reputation for remembering every slight. By the time most men learned his name, it was already too late to use it against him. He ran numbers rackets, controlled territory, settled disputes. But more than that, he understood Harlem in a way outsiders never did. He knew which pastors kept quiet, which shopkeepers needed protection, which politicians smiled in public and begged in private. This was the Harlem of the late 1930s, a place humming with brilliance and bruised by pressure. Black excellence bloomed in music halls and literary salons, while police patrols treated the streets like occupied territory. White mob interests eyed the neighborhood as a resource. City officials called it a problem. Bumpy called it home. He dressed sharp, not for vanity, but for posture. In Harlem, how a man carried himself mattered as much as what he said, and Bumpy carried himself like a king who didn't need a crown. The streets reflected that confidence back at him. Men stepped aside when he passed. Conversations paused, then resumed softer. Not out of fear, out of understanding. Because Bumpy Johnson was not reckless. He was precise. Which made what happened on 135th Street impossible to ignore. The dead man had a name. He always did. He was a runner, low-level, ambitious, the kind who talked too much and listened too little. Someone who thought proximity to power meant possession of it. Someone who forgot that in Harlem, loyalty wasn't assumed. It was earned, then guarded. Rumors had been floating for weeks, quiet ones, the kind that slipped between dice games and backroom meetings. Money missing, messages delayed, names whispered to the wrong ears. Still, no one expected this, especially not here, especially not now. Because the real tension wasn't between Bumpy and the man on the ground. It was between Bumpy and the people who would come asking questions. The police would call it gang violence. The newspapers would dress it up as another Negro underworld killing. City Hall would pretend it was proof that Harlem couldn't govern itself. But Bumpy knew better. This shot threatened balance, and balance was everything. As sirens wailed in the distance, Bumpy finally turned away from the body. He didn't look at the shooter. Didn't need to. Orders had been given earlier that night. Warnings had been issued. Lines had been drawn. This wasn't vengeance. This was enforcement. Still, enforcement had consequences. By morning, the Italians would hear. By noon, the police captain assigned to Harlem would demand answers. By nightfall, someone with a badge or a bankroll would try to make an example out of him. They always did. Because men like Bumpy Johnson terrified authority. Not because they were violent, but because they were organized, thoughtful, unapologetic. He walked down the block as patrol cars screamed closer, his footsteps measured, unhurried. A few men fell in behind him, not bodyguards, not soldiers, witnesses, the kind who saw everything and said nothing. Harlem watched from behind curtains and door frames. They didn't cheer. They waited. Because the real story wasn't the shot. It was what would come after. By dawn, the body was gone, chalk washed away by street cleaners who didn't ask questions. But the silence it left behind lingered. Bumpy stood in his office later that morning, staring out over the neighborhood. Sunlight caught dust motes in the air. The city looked peaceful, deceptively so. A knock came at the door, soft, controlled. Bad news always knocked that way. Bumpy didn't turn around. "Come in," he said. As the door opened, he already felt it, the shift, the tightening, the moment when pressure began to build. Someone had heard the trigger pull, and they weren't going to let it go unanswered. The man who stepped into Bumpy Johnson's office carried the smell of cold air and bad news. He was young, but not careless. One of Bumpy's quiet ones, the kind who spoke only when the words mattered. His eyes didn't wander. His hands stayed visible. Respect, practiced, and precise. "They picked up the body before sunrise," the man said. "Captain Muldoon's already asking questions." That name settled into the room like smoke. Police Captain Patrick Muldoon had been Harlem's problem for 3 years. Irish, thick-necked, and proud of the fact that he didn't need permission to swing a baton. He ran the precinct like a personal territory, treating the badge less like a responsibility and more like a weapon. Muldoon hated men he couldn't intimidate. Bumpy Johnson topped that list. Bumpy turned from the window slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes sharpened. "What kind of questions?" he asked. The runner hesitated. "The kind meant to be heard." Bumpy nodded once. That confirmed it. Muldoon wasn't investigating. He was announcing. By midday, Harlem felt it. Squad cars idled longer on corners. Officers leaned heavier on their nightsticks. Store owners were questioned twice for the same answers. Men were stopped for nothing more than walking too confidently. It was pressure, applied broadly, deliberately. A message. Muldoon wanted everyone to know that a shot fired in his precinct did not go unanswered. And more importantly, that Bumpy Johnson was not untouchable. That illusion never lasted long. The first summons came just after lunch. Not an arrest, an invitation. 2 plainclothes detectives appeared outside Bumpy's favorite lunch spot, hats tilted just enough to signal authority. They didn't raise their voices, didn't draw attention. They didn't have to. "Captain Muldoon would like a word," one of them said. Bumpy finished his coffee, paid the bill, stood. "Then he should have come himself," Bumpy replied calmly. The detectives exchanged a look. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. "He's busy," the other said. "So am I." Bumpy stepped past them, coat brushing their shoulders. Not aggressive, not apologetic. Just unmoved. That night, the pressure doubled. Muldoon escalated the only way he knew how. Raids. 3 numbers houses hit before midnight. No warrants worth the paper they weren't printed on. Cash seized. Men dragged in, roughed up, released without charges just before dawn. It wasn't about law enforcement. It was about humiliation, and everyone knew it. Harlem had seen this pattern before. A show of force meant to remind the neighborhood who held the legal power, who could kick in doors and call it justice. But this time, something felt different, because Bumpy Johnson still hadn't responded, and that silence was louder than any threat. By the 3rd day, Muldoon couldn't stand it anymore. He sent word again, this time not through detectives, through a messenger who didn't belong. A white lawyer with polished shoes and nervous hands arrived at Bumpy's office just before dusk. He introduced himself quickly, as if the name alone might invite trouble. "The captain feels it would be productive," the lawyer said, choosing his words carefully, "for you to come down to the precinct, clear a few things up." Bumpy studied him. "How polite," he said. The lawyer swallowed. "He'd prefer tonight." Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "Tell the captain," he said evenly, "that if he wants to speak with me, he's welcome to step into Harlem and do it like a man." The lawyer blinked. "Sir, with respect." "You're finished," Bumpy said. The man left without another word, and just like that, the line was drawn. Captain Muldoon exploded. Witnesses later said they heard his shouting from the hallway, that he slammed his desk hard enough to rattle the windows, that he called Bumpy Johnson every name he could think of, and several he couldn't say in public. By midnight, Muldoon had made his decision. If Bumpy wouldn't come to him, he'd bring the full weight of the precinct down on Bumpy. The next morning, Harlem woke up under siege. Uniforms everywhere. Squad cars blocking intersections. Officers stopping men just to watch them explain themselves. Then came the arrests. Not Bumpy. His people. Trusted lieutenants. Bookkeepers. Drivers. Men with clean enough records to make the charges look thin, but loud enough to make headlines. Muldoon wanted Bumpy to feel it. And for the first time since the shot on 135th Street, Bumpy Johnson did. He sat in his office, listening to names being brought in, locations being hit, money being frozen. Each report tightened the room another inch. This wasn't about the dead runner anymore. This was about control. Muldoon wanted submission, and he was prepared to burn Harlem to get it. Late that afternoon, Bumpy stood and put on his coat. The men in the room went quiet. "Where you going?" one of them asked. Bumpy adjusted his hat. "To hear what the captain's been saying behind my back," he replied. A pause. "That's his house," someone warned. Bumpy's voice was steady. "So is this." He stepped out into the street, Harlem parting instinctively around him. Word traveled faster than he did. By the time he reached Lenox Avenue, people were already watching from doorways and windows, because everyone knew what this meant. This wasn't going to end quietly. The trigger pull that wasn't meant to be heard had reached the wrong ears. And now, authority and legend were walking toward each other, with nowhere left to step aside. Captain Patrick Muldoon believed in pressure the way other men believed in God. You applied it long enough, hard enough, and eventually something gave. Bones cracked, mouths opened, knees bent. In his mind, Harlem was no different than any other territory he'd worked, just louder, darker, and full of men who needed reminding of their place. What he never understood was that Harlem did not bend. It endured. Bumpy Johnson did not go to the precinct. That alone unsettled Muldoon. Instead, Bumpy went where pressure couldn't reach him the same way, through the neighborhood itself. He walked Lenox Avenue slowly, deliberately, stopping to speak with shop owners, porters, churchmen, and mothers standing watch over children on stoops. He didn't give orders. He listened. And in Harlem, that meant everything. A grocer told him about officers overturning crates just to watch fruit spill. A barber described a boy slammed against a wall for laughing too loudly. A preacher mentioned patrolmen interrupting evening prayer, claiming noise complaints. Each story added weight. Each one sharpened the edge. Bumpy thanked them all the same way, quietly, with his eyes, with his presence. He made no promises. He didn't need to. They knew who he was, and they trusted him to answer disrespect in the only language authority understood. Muldoon, meanwhile, was enjoying himself. From his office window, he watched squad cars come and go, paperwork stack up, men scurry at his command. Every arrest report felt like a small victory. Every complaint ignored felt like proof of his power. He lit a cigarette and leaned back in his chair. "Let him stew," he told his lieutenant. "He'll come crawling soon enough." The lieutenant hesitated. "You sure pushing this hard is smart?" Muldoon snorted. "Smart is letting them think they run something. I'm reminding them who owns the badge." The lieutenant said nothing more, but unease had already crept in, because Muldoon's methods worked best on men who feared losing something, and Bumpy Johnson had already lost everything worth being afraid of. The real challenge came that evening. Bumpy was meeting with several community figures in the back room of a small restaurant when the door swung open without warning. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, hands resting too close to their holsters. The room went silent. "We're looking for Ellsworth Johnson," one officer said. Bumpy didn't turn around. "You found him," he replied. The officers exchanged looks. "You're wanted for questioning," the second said. "About what?" Bumpy asked calmly. "About a shooting." Bumpy finally faced them. "Then ask your questions," he said. The officer bristled. "At the precinct." Bumpy's eyes didn't leave his. "No," he said. "Right here." The tension was thick enough to choke on. Every man in the room understood what was happening. This wasn't procedure. This was provocation. The officers took a step forward, then stopped. Because Bumpy Johnson did not step back. He stood, slow and deliberate, closing the space himself. "You don't get to drag me out of my neighborhood like a thief," he said quietly. "If you've got something to say it." The officers hesitated just long enough for dignity to make its point. Then one of them muttered, "Captain Muldoon wants you tomorrow morning." Bumpy nodded once. "I'll be there," he said. The officers left, and the room exhaled. That promise traveled fast. By nightfall, everyone knew. Bumpy Johnson was going to the precinct, not summoned, not escorted, walking in. The next morning, the air around the station house felt different. Officers stood straighter. Desk sergeants whispered. Even Muldoon sensed it, the shift in energy that came when something important was about to happen. At 10 sharp, Bumpy Johnson stepped through the front doors. No entourage, no lawyer. Just his coat, his hat, and the weight of Harlem behind him. Conversations died mid-sentence. Typewriters slowed. Eyes followed him as he crossed the floor. Muldoon watched from his office doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. "So," he said loudly, "the king decided to show up." Bumpy stopped a few feet away. "I came because you've been making a mess," he replied, "and you're doing it in my house." Muldoon laughed, sharp and ugly. "Your house?" he said. "This is a police precinct. You don't own a damn thing." Bumpy held his gaze. "Then stop treating it like your personal clubhouse," he said, "and start acting like a captain." The room went still. Muldoon's smile vanished. "Careful, boy," he snapped. "You forget who you're talking to." That word, boy, hung in the air like a slap. Every officer in the room felt it. Bumpy did not react. He stepped closer. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he said evenly. "Not in front of my people. Not ever." Muldoon leaned forward, face flushed. "I can lock you up right now," he said, "on suspicion alone." "You can try," Bumpy replied, "but you'll be explaining it to the same people who keep your streets quiet." A murmur rippled through the room. Muldoon's authority wavered, just for a second, and that was all Bumpy needed. The confrontation had begun, and it was no longer about a gunshot. It was about respect, and respect, once challenged, demanded an answer. Silence ruled the precinct. Not the comfortable kind, not the kind born of order. This was the kind that followed disrespect, the kind that waited to see who would blink first. Captain Patrick Muldoon stared at Bumpy Johnson like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid. "You think you're untouchable," Muldoon said slowly. "That's your mistake." Bumpy didn't raise his voice. "No," he replied. "My mistake would be letting you think you can run Harlem by terrorizing women and shopkeepers." A few heads turned. Muldoon caught it. He straightened, puffed his chest, and turned to the room like a preacher addressing his congregation. "You hear this?" he barked. "This man thinks he speaks for you." Bumpy spoke before anyone else could. "They didn't ask you to speak for them," he said, "and they sure as hell didn't ask you to punish them." Muldoon's face reddened. You're a criminal, he spat, and criminals don't get opinions in my precinct. Bumpy nodded. That's the difference between you and me, he said. I don't pretend I'm something I'm not. The insult landed clean. Muldoon stepped forward close enough for spit to fly. You think one dead runner gives you the right to lecture me? He growled. You think I don't know how this works? You think I don't know you ordered it? Bumpy didn't deny it. He tilted his head slightly. You don't know why, he said. Muldoon scoffed. Enlighten me. That man was selling names, Bumpy continued. Mine. Yours. People who didn't deserve to be dragged into your numbers game. Muldoon laughed harshly. You expect me to thank you for murder? No, Bumpy replied. I expect you to understand boundaries. That word, boundaries, made Muldoon snap. He slammed his palm onto the desk behind him. There are no boundaries, he shouted. There's the law, and there's you breaking it. Bumpy leaned in, voice low. And there's you abusing it. The room felt smaller. Officers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others watched intently, realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about long after they retired. Muldoon pointed at Bumpy. You walk out of here because I allow it, he said. Don't forget that. Bumpy's eyes hardened. You let me walk because you don't have the proof, he said. And you don't have the proof because you're too busy shaking down innocent people instead of doing your job. Muldoon froze. Then he smiled. Slow. Dangerous. Lock him up, he said. Two officers hesitated. Muldoon's voice rose. I said, lock him up. They stepped forward reluctantly. Bumpy didn't resist. He raised his hands calmly, letting them cuff him. Metal clicked. A few officers winced. Muldoon leaned close, whispering, This is where legends end, he said. In a cell. Forgotten. Bumpy met his eyes. You should have listened, he said quietly. Muldoon laughed, but it sounded forced. The cell was cold, bare, unforgiving. Bumpy sat on the bench, hands resting on his knees, eyes closed. He didn't pace, didn't curse, didn't demand a phone call. He waited. Because he understood something Muldoon didn't. Power wasn't about how loud you could shout. It was about who answered when you didn't. An hour passed. Then another. Outside the precinct, something was happening. Word spread through Harlem like electricity. Bumpy Johnson had been arrested. Not taken quietly, not for cause, but as a display. And Harlem responded. First came the phones. Calls to city council offices, newspaper editors, church leaders dialing contacts they'd been saving for years. Then came the people. Not a riot, not a mob, a gathering. Men in work coats, women with children in tow, pastors, shopkeepers, musicians. They stood outside the precinct in silence, watching, waiting. Muldoon looked out the window and felt his stomach tighten. How many? He asked. Too many, his lieutenant replied. Get them to disperse, Muldoon snapped. They're not breaking any laws. Muldoon clenched his jaw. That was the problem. Inside the cell, Bumpy finally opened his eyes. Footsteps approached. Different ones. Measured. Confident. The cell door opened. A man in a tailored suit stood there, city badge pinned to his lapel. Behind him, Muldoon hovered, tight-lipped. Mr. Johnson, the man said. I'm Deputy Commissioner Harris. Bumpy stood slowly. I know who you are, he replied. Harris nodded. We've received concerns, he said carefully, about how this situation has been handled. Muldoon bristled. This is my precinct. And it's the city's headache, Harris replied coolly. He turned back to Bumpy. You're being released, he said, pending further investigation. Muldoon exploded. You can't be serious! Harris didn't look at him. I am. The cuffs came off. Bumpy rubbed his wrists once. Captain, he said, turning to Muldoon, this didn't have to go this way. Muldoon said nothing. He couldn't. Because for the first time, the room understood. The The trigger pull no one was meant to hear had exposed something deeper. Not just corruption, fear. Bumpy walked out of the precinct into a wall of quiet support. No cheers, no chants, just presence, respect. He stopped at the top of the steps and turned back. Muldoon watched from the doorway, his authority leaking away in plain sight. Bumpy tipped his hat once. Not in triumph, in acknowledgement. The balance had shifted, and everyone, badge or no badge, felt it. The crowd did not surge when Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the precinct. It held. That restraint said more than shouting ever could. Men removed their hats. Women tightened coats around children. Eyes followed Bumpy as he descended the steps, not as a criminal walking free, but as a man who had just forced authority to blink. He did not raise a fist. He did not speak. He simply walked through them. And that was enough. Inside the precinct, Captain Patrick Muldoon stood frozen at the top of the stairs, watching the neighborhood reclaim its composure without his permission. Deputy Commissioner Harris turned to him. "This ends now," Harris said quietly. Muldoon scoffed. "You're undermining my command." "You undermined yourself," Harris replied. "You turned a shooting into a spectacle. You turned enforcement into provocation." Muldoon's jaw worked. "They're criminals. They're citizens," Harris corrected. "And you just reminded them why they don't trust us." The words cut deep, because they were true. The fallout was immediate. By that evening, Muldoon's raids were halted. Men picked up without charges were quietly released. Seized cash, what could be accounted for, was returned through lawyers who suddenly found themselves very busy. Newspapers ran careful headlines the next morning. Not sympathetic, not accusatory, just curious. Questions raised over Harlem policing tactics. City Hall asked for reports. Internal Affairs requested statements. Muldoon was told to take leave. Temporary, administrative. Everyone knew what it meant. Harlem absorbed the shift like a deep breath after suffocation. Storefronts reopened fully. Music spilled back into the streets. Patrol cars still rolled, but slower, more cautiously. Respect had entered the equation, not fear. Bumpy Johnson did not celebrate. That night, he sat alone in his office, jacket off, tie loosened, staring at the same window he'd stared through days earlier. The neighborhood below glowed under streetlights, alive and humming. A knock came, soft, familiar. One of his lieutenants entered. "They're saying Muldoon's finished," the man said. Bumpy nodded. "He did it to himself." The lieutenant hesitated. "People are saying you won." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "This wasn't a game," he said, "and nobody wins when blood starts conversations." The man nodded, understanding. "What about the runner?" he asked. Bumpy's eyes darkened. "He made his choice," he said. "So did the captain." Justice, in Bumpy's world, was never clean. It was necessary. A week later, the official transfer came through. Captain Muldoon was reassigned out of Harlem. No press conference, no apology. Just a quiet reshuffling of power. Those who knew understood. Those who didn't never would. Muldoon packed his office in silence. As he closed the last drawer, he paused, staring at the empty desk where authority had once felt permanent. He had believed the badge was enough. He had been wrong. Back on the streets, Bumpy Johnson's name carried new weight. Not because he had ordered a killing, but because he had walked into a precinct, stood his ground, and walked out with his dignity intact. Men spoke of it in barbershops. Women mentioned it in kitchens. Young boys listened carefully, learning an unspoken lesson about power and restraint. Respect wasn't demanded. It was enforced, carefully. Bumpy met with community leaders days later. Pastors, business owners, men who rarely shared the same table. They thanked him. He waved it off. "This wasn't about me," he said. "It was about reminding them we're not invisible." A pastor nodded. "You did that." Bumpy looked around the room. "We did," he corrected. But even as calm returned, Bumpy understood something essential. The trigger pull that started all of this had changed the rules. The city was watching now. So were the Italians. So were men who thought power only flowed one way. The balance had been restored, for the moment. But balance never stayed still. It required maintenance. And legends paid that price quietly. Late that night, Bumpy stood alone again, looking out over Harlem. The streets were peaceful. Too peaceful. He knew better than to mistake silence for safety. Still, he allowed himself one moment of acknowledgement. Not pride. Responsibility. Because justice, once delivered, became expectation. And expectation was heavier than fear. Time did what it always did in Harlem. It softened the noise but sharpened the memory. Within months, the story of the arrest stopped being about the precinct and started being about what came after. About what didn't happen. About the doors that stayed open, the raids that never returned, the way officers learned to knock instead of kick. Captain Muldoon's name faded quickly. He became a cautionary reference, something muttered in roll calls and whispered in city offices when someone suggested leaning too hard on Harlem again. But Bumpy Johnson's name traveled in the opposite direction. It gained gravity. The Italians took notice first. They always did. Men who understood power recognized what had happened immediately. This wasn't muscle. This wasn't luck. This was influence applied with precision. A man who could walk into a police station alone and walk out free had leverage that couldn't be bought or bullied. Meetings changed tone. Deals slowed down. Requests became negotiations. They stopped testing him in public. That was the real legacy of the confrontation. Not fear, calculation. In Harlem, the impact ran deeper. Young men didn't just hear that Bumpy Johnson stood up to a police captain. They heard how. They learned that he didn't shout, didn't swing, didn't run. He stood, spoke plainly, and forced authority to expose itself. That lesson mattered, because Harlem had been taught for decades that survival meant keeping your head down. Bumpy taught them something else. Dignity could be defended. Community leaders leaned into that shift. Pastors spoke more openly. Shop owners pushed back against harassment. Complaints were filed where silence used to live. Not because the police had changed overnight, but because someone had proven that pressure could be returned. Bumpy himself remained unchanged. He still rose early, still dressed sharply, still paid attention to details others ignored. He knew that legend was a dangerous thing, useful, but heavy. Men started asking for his blessing. He refused. "Handle your business clean," he told them, "and you won't need my name." That restraint became part of the myth. Years later, when historians tried to pinpoint the moment Harlem's relationship with authority shifted, even slightly, they circled back to that winter morning. Not the gunshot, the walk, the silence outside the precinct, the release. Those were the images that endured, because they told a different story than the one the city liked to tell. Bumpy Johnson did not live forever. No legend does. But moments like that outlived him. They became reference points, quiet markers of what was possible when a man refused to be diminished. He never wrote it down, never corrected anyone who got parts of it wrong. Legends didn't need footnotes. On warm summer nights years later, old men still spoke about it on stoops. How he walked in, how they couldn't hold him, how the whole block went quiet. They spoke with respect, not awe, because awe fades. Respect doesn't. Bumpy once said to a friend, long after Muldoon was gone, "Power don't come from being loud. It comes from being right, and being ready to stand there when someone tells you you're wrong." That sentence never made the papers, but it stayed in Harlem. The trigger pull that no one was meant to hear had done its damage. But the response, that's what made history listen. This was never just about a gunshot in the dark. It wasn't about a dead runner, or a bruised police captain, or a single morning inside a Harlem precinct. Those were only the sparks. The real fire burned underneath, quiet, steady, and long overdue. This was about dignity, about a neighborhood tired of being spoken at instead of spoken to, about a man who understood that power didn't always need to be loud to be absolute. Sometimes, it only needed to be willing to stand still when authority tried to push it down. Bumpy Johnson didn't walk into that precinct to prove he was dangerous. Harlem already knew that. He walked in to prove something far rarer, that respect could be enforced without chaos, that justice didn't have to look like vengeance, and that a legend wasn't made by how many men feared you, but by how many stood silently when you walked past. The police captain thought the badge was enough. He thought pressure would break the man in front of him. What he didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson had been carrying pressure his entire life, and learned how to return it without flinching. That's why the trigger pull that wasn't meant to be heard ended up echoing louder than anyone expected. Because it didn't just expose a crime, it exposed a truth. And once that truth was seen, once the balance shifted, even slightly, it could never be unseen. This wasn't about one man's pride. It was about a community's right to stand upright. And sometimes, history doesn't change with speeches or riots or revolutions. Sometimes, it changes when a legend walks into the room, refuses to bow, and walks out exactly the same way he entered, with his dignity intact.